Well, I'm glad so many people were able to come, including some friends from the community. As I understand, a former teacher or so, and the author's father. So I'm delighted to introduce Ted Conover. You know, there's a lot of questions you could ask about Ted when you look at his work. The one that comes to mind, for me at least right now, is what do you make of a guy who helps his 18-year-old son jump a freight car in the Denver rail yards near the South Platte River and ride that train through Wyoming into Utah? I don't know how far you got. It ended in Salt Lake City at some point. Anyway, you can read about this particular account in the July issue of Outside Magazine in a piece that I think is as much about parenting as it is about train operating. For at least a couple of decades, Ted Conover has been willing to immerse himself in tough places and then write about what happens. 2 months, for example, as an inspector in a Nebraska meatpacking plant. You might have read about that in the Harper Magazine article, The Way of All Flesh. Working as a prison guard at Sing Sing, that yielded the book New Jack. Traveling with migrants, crossing the border illegally, that's Coyotes, who Jennifer Karras was telling me she taught at Cornell.
In the writing program.
In the writing program, and recently I just heard this latest adventure. I don't know how dangerous, well, this could be dangerous, spending time with a veterinarian in Iowa. And he's going back for more for a piece destined for Harper's. Anyway, Ted puts himself in interesting spots and we benefit from it. In his most recent book, The Routes of Man, which narrates travels in Peru, Africa, China, and elsewhere. In the opening of that book, Ted writes, "While I have benefited enormously from formal education, it has never seemed to me sufficient. It has repeatedly sparked in me a visceral longing for the lessons of life outside. I think only a few writers that come easily to mind have exercised this longing for life outside to quite the extent that Conover has done. John McPhee comes to mind. The George Orwell of Down and Out in Paris and London comes to mind. We're fortunate then to have Denver's son, an occasional railroad scufflaw, Ted Conover."
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Doug, for reminding me of a nerve-wracking experience. It was never my idea to take my son on freight trains. That was sort of an unintended consequence of something I did years ago. If you live long enough, sometimes these things come around. And on the one hand, I was glad that he read my book. And it's funny, lots of my friends seem to think all of a sudden it would be like two of me out there riding freight trains. It's not at all like that. It's like a father teaching his son to break the law. And the son telling him he'd always wanted to see this side of me. Because he so seldom had it. And that was a surprise, actually. I thought I hadn't been quite that much of a scoutmaster dad, but apparently I was. Anyway, we are all of us, I think, many people. Some of these are quite clear in everyday life. We're students, we're teachers, we're partners, we're sons and daughters, some of us are parents. But there exists the possibility to try out other lives now and then. you can imagine another life you'd like to try, and you have the ability, it often doesn't take much money, say to hop a freight train and live that way for a while. Many people do a version of this by going to another country where people don't know them. They get to speak another language and reinvent themselves in a certain way, which is an exciting thing to do. And I think for many people at certain points in life, when a relationship ends, suddenly we might feel free to reinvent ourselves in certain ways. That idea of not necessarily wanting to be somebody else, but wanting to know what it's like for other people is something I felt over and over and over again. And it strikes some people as strange that I would continue to want to do some of these things. But to me, it's more like, who wouldn't want to try these things? Doesn't life get sort of ordinary after a while? I mean, wouldn't you like to mix it up? This is the thing I keep coming back to. So I do. I'm going to talk today about cultural exploration of this kind, of leaving your normal world and learning about a different world. And I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of a writer who uses the first person as a tool in making another world or an experience of another world come alive. And if that sounds too complicated, I'll give you a bunch of examples. Okay? Some years ago, I had a kind of revelation in a freight railroad yard in California. I was researching a senior anthropology thesis about hobos at Amherst College, and riding the rails was my field work. It was early afternoon, and the train I'd been riding on since the previous night had just arrived in Bakersfield. I'd been by myself the whole of the trip, sitting alone in a boxcar. As the train stopped, and the whoosh of compressed air being released signaled it wasn't going any further, I threw my bedroll to the ground and jumped out. As I did so, I looked down the length of the train and noticed that somebody else had done the same thing. That's an interesting moment when you're riding freight trains, because on the one hand, you and that other person are complete strangers. On the other, you've just shared an uncomfortable experience lasting several hours. A person in that situation naturally is curious about the other person, wants to get to know him. But how do you begin? As we approached each other, I saw that this other freight hopper was about my age, and I was pretty sure he was Mexican. So, using my best Denver Public Schools Spanish, I looked at him and ventured, ¿Cómo está usted? The revelation was that he answered and I could understand him. ¿Cómo estás tú? He replied, using the familiar form of address. And in the exchange and days-long acquaintance that followed, I learned something I hadn't known at Amherst College, that a person like me might actually get to know a person like him. It was like, yeah, I'd been able to speak to some railroad hobos, but here, this was going one step beyond. We went to the rescue mission together that evening, and the next morning he encouraged me to join himself and other migrants on a street corner where contractors in need of labor could find it. Because he vouched for me, I got taken by a pickup to a vineyard where the job was pruning vines. It was hard work and I wasn't very good at it. But the time I spent in that world planted a seed of thought in my mind. I saw that people like Enrique were in many ways the true modern-day version of that classic American migrant I'd been seeking, the hobo. And further, I saw that it was within the realm of possibility that a person like me might hang out with people like him. And that's not such an easy thing, as I'm sure you know. Finding an authentic way to interact, finding a more authentic way to interact than the common one society presents us with, often with a Mexican as employee, is not a simple matter. And that's how my first book about hobos paved the way for my second book about Mexican migrants. The larger point, of course, is that cultural exploration begins the minute you learn a new word, the minute you walk into somebody else's house, the minute you decide there are some things you could probably learn just by listening, by hanging out. When it comes to nonfiction writing, I think there's a scale. On one end of it is memoir and personal essay, which are often taught in schools and colleges as part of the creative writing curriculum. And then at the other end is straight journalism, writing about the world, which is less often taught. On the personal essay end is the first-person voice, and on the journalism end is the third-person voice. In recent years, however, an exciting and wonderful thing has happened, which is that great writing has been taking root in the space between these two poles. The world, it turns out, can be written about in the first person, which is often what I do. Before we go further with the first person, let's look at another difference underlying those two poles. Nonfiction writing needs to be about something true, something real. On the personal essay side of things, that store of information can be labeled things that happened to me in my life. On the journalism end, it can be labeled things I learned about other people by talking to them and doing some research. What we aim for in the middle might be called things I learned about myself while learning about other people, or even better, what I learned about using my own experience to tell stories about other people. Hope I'm not getting too complicated. Along with Professor Hess, I've been involved for the past few years in judging nonfiction writing awards for the Norman Mailer Writing Center in New York. The panel I'm on every year gets to consider a handful of well-written submissions in the creative nonfiction category. Almost always, these are personal essays about difficult experiences in students' lives. But occasionally, they're about experience unrelated to trauma, which the student actively sought out. We always perk up when we come across these and wish there were more like them. One reason is that they show an active and enterprising mind at work. Another is that we know, I think, that this kind of material has a better chance of getting published someday. There's just a lot of memoir and personal essay out there, and I think it's often harder work for people to get outside themselves and into the world. Material between the two poles goes by the name creative nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, literary journalism. Nobody's quite settled on a single label for it. Not all of it is first person. Some of its best practitioners shy from it because it has pitfalls, which I'll get to. One of my fellow judges this year was Adrienne LeBlanc, who spent, 15 years living with mostly young women who she got to know because they were girlfriends of drug dealers years ago. The guys would get busted. Adrienne became interested in the women and then in their children and stuck with it. She doesn't mention herself in her book Random Family at all. Another judge was Annie Fadiman, who wrote a book about a Hmong girl, H-M-O-N-G, immigrant girl in Merced, California with epilepsy, in a book called The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down. So it's about how Hmong traditional medicine conflicts with American medicine in a very dramatic and upsetting way often. And you feel both for the parents who are trying to do the best thing for their epileptic daughter and for the doctors who have the same goal in mind, but you can't imagine that they do have the same goal in mind because their two ways of getting there are so different. Anyway, I think the word I appears 5 or 6 times in Anne Fadiman's book, which makes it first person technically, I guess. But like Adrienne, she's very skeptical of putting herself in the story because she wants to be about them. She wants to respect her subjects. And I admire what they do. It just doesn't work as well for me that way. I find it easier to explain the difference it made because I was in the room. the ways it made me feel in certain situations. I think these translate to readers in a way that can be very effective. And what I'd like to do is share 3 short passages I've written over the years of situations I've approached in the first person, so that you can see the difference that makes. So the first passage is from my book, Coyotes. This describes most of the year spent traveling in the company of migrants, both in the States and in the Mexican states. And this particular chapter takes place in southern Mexico, in Querétaro State, in a shop where they make what we called, as I was growing up, huaraches, which they call huaraches, and the shop is called a huaracheria, and they actually use the tread of old tires. They cut it, they custom make these for your feet. It's my first and only pair of custom footwear was made in this huaracheria, and this is where one day I heard a really interesting story. So I traveled, gosh, 3 or 4 months with a number of young men and a woman from this little village in Querétaro, from Arizona. We'd gone from the village all the way up to Idaho. And then they'd been, on the first try, they'd been deported from Utah, but they came back. I've been with them a lot, and they were great people, and I loved hanging out with them. Okay. Jesus, who's sort of the ringleader, Jesus in particular loved to talk about his experiences in the States, usually in the form of anecdotes. Learning English was one of his main preoccupations, and many of the tales concerned the obstacles he encountered along the way. One day, several of us were seated around the huaracheria of Tiberio's brother, Ignacio, watching him and his assistants cut and sew the leather for sandals. Teo, so that's how they called me, Teo. Teo asked Jesus, how do you say it when a girl's wearing perfume? What do you say to her? I like your smell? Is that it? I like the way you smell? Yes, that's it. I like the way you smell. He interrupted. Well, you know what I said to my girlfriend there one night? Jesus had dated a number of American girls. None of them spoke Spanish. I shook my head. We were driving in the owner's car, that old Cadillac he gave us, and she smelled good. So I took her real close like this, and I said, baby, I like the way you stink. I burst out laughing, and Jesus explained it to the others. In Spanish, you use the same verb for smell or stink, and Jesus hadn't appreciated the difference. Did she explain it to you, I asked? Yes, but she was mad, said Jesus. Oh, we made some big mistakes up there. Remember Tiberio and the Burger King? They asked us if we wanted everything on it. Yes, I said, but no mustache. What? She asked. No mustache, I said. I thought I was saying mustard. None of these guys like mustard. Another time he had suggested to his girlfriend at dinner at the Pussycat Pizza Hut, he meant to say, and yet another time he asked the foreman if he could borrow the fuck you from his trailer. What? Said the foreman. The fuck you? Repeated this a bit nervously. He knew the phrase had a bad meaning. Do you know the answer? He knew it had a bad meaning, but thought it also meant vacuum. The words sounded identical to him. So did eyes and ice. These confusions had gotten him into lots of trouble, he said, offering extra explanations to the others in the room so they'd understand what he was telling me. So, several times in the book up to there, I had explained how silly it made me feel to ask for an explanation of words in Spanish, especially bad words. Forms of the verb chingar, for example, which is the all-purpose Mexican epithet, and there must be about 20 different ways you can use that word, and they found it hilarious when I would say, what does this mean? Like, it would crack them up, because supposedly as a American I was a highly educated and sort of higher thinking person. And to have to, you know, they just really loved explaining these profanities to me. And I must say it made it more easy to remember all the drama around every explanation. This book is not a new book. It's been in print for almost 30 years. And I think the main reason is the inherent drama of the immigrant experience, which is essentially the American experience. But I think another is the parallel story of an outsider's willing immersion. The first-person narrator willing to look awkward in the cause of understanding other people. The difficulty of getting to know other people can be talked about, and it can make a good story because almost everybody can relate to it. Guillemaz hasn't been the stranger walking into a room of people who largely know each other, but we don't know anybody. It's like a universal of human experience, I think. And so, to me, it's a way to get readers to pay attention to subjects that might otherwise not interest them. That is, I guess you could say, a strategy behind some of my writing. I'm going to switch the order of the next example. And read you a short passage from The Roots of Man. So I wanted to write about the difference roads make. They make all kinds of differences in different parts of the world. You know, in places where there is war, roads are a vulnerability and a strategic advantage, whether it's Iraq or the West Bank or Afghanistan. I mean, any veterans in the audience know the danger of roads in America's most recent conflicts. Anybody who follows the news does. That is one of the most dangerous places to be. I went to the West Bank to write about Israeli control of roads traveled by Palestinians, and I wrote about it both from the perspective of some Palestinian students I've gotten to know and of some Israeli soldiers who let me hang out with them. I think the rain just started. I wrote about a road in Peru that lets endangered wood get out of the rainforest. I followed that wood to a very fancy apartment on the Upper East Side in Manhattan. And I went back to East Africa, where I'd gone in, when my first piece came out, early 90s. I wanted to find new ways to write about the AIDS epidemic, and read that in sub-Saharan Africa it was often a disease of women as well as men, and that some of the more prosperous people in society, truck drivers, were implicated in spreading it because of their mobility. And I thought, wow, truck drivers, that's the kind of person Americans might connect to. We have our own trucker mythology, and in East Africa there's a slightly different one, but they're characters, they're figures, and I thought if I could travel with them, I bet I would learn a lot. So that was the first story I ever wrote for the New Yorker, and I kept in touch over the years with several of the guys I had become acquainted with then. Some of them died. You don't always know why. Malaria was still killing more people than AIDS when I was there, but AIDS later began to kill more. But several of the guys I was with remained alive. I went back and found them and took another trip. On this trip, I wanted to spend more time talking to women, which had been a big problem the first time because the drivers, everything had to filter through the drivers. And That's not always good. Filters can be helpful, they can be unhelpful. So I took a couple of weeks in Nairobi and approached a group that it's called the Kenyan Network of Women with HIV/AIDS. They've received a lot of money from the Global Fund and other organizations because they're doing great work supporting HIV-positive women. And they set up a group discussion between me and several women, and this is an account of that discussion. The women in Nairobi were particularly well-spoken and engaging. I bought lunch for 7 of them at the headquarters of Kenwa. They were better educated and better informed than many of their rural counterparts. The group's literature explained they were offered vocational training and seed money so they can sell sundries to become financially independent. So most of them had become infected while doing sex work. Many of them had children, and Kenwa tried to help with school fees too. The group also offered medical care, including antiretroviral drugs, and helped feed some of the thousands of the city's AIDS orphans. Among the forthright of the 7 women were Constance, Mary, and Jane. Victorian names are one of the great delights of East Africa. Constance was very pretty and wore an eye-catching black and white striped top, which was of a piece with her idea that, quote, these men are attracted by sight, so you have to look good. The other women were neither unattractive nor glamorous. Mary was buxom and heavy, Jane was slender. All of them worked bars, they explained, and there was nothing secretive about it. We boost their business, explained Mary. Sometimes the bar had a back room they could take clients to, or if the man wants, quote, if the man wants to take you for a long time, he will take you to a different place or his hotel room, said Jane. I'm going to skip a few of the more graphic details, but they're in here if you're interested. They flirted with me, saying Wazungu, the plural of Mzungu, made fine customers and they liked them very much. When they asked how much a prostitute cost in New York, and I guessed that prices might start around $100, several laughed and asked if I would take them there immediately. Constance said that hooking could be better than being married because you had more choice over the men you were with, and the husband might not give you enough to live on, might let you go hungry. Here you are your own boss. But Jane made it sound like almost forced labor. We go because there is nothing else we can do in life. And you don't need capital to get started. The only asset I need is what I have, and she gestured to her body. Mary added that it was very, very difficult to go into another line of work after commercial sex because you have to work a month to make as much money as you might in a few nights as a prostitute. Occasionally the work was poor. Sometimes the man is sweet, and if you hadn't asked for money, you might forget, said Mary. Some of the men were funny, some would buy them drinks. But it sounded as though more commonly it was not. Men could be drunk, could be bores, could be rough. Some stank. There are people you smell and you can smell them the next day. Seriously, you do not want to meet that man again, said Mary. Jane added, even after you get out of the shower, you can smell him. And of course, the downside can be much steeper. Sometimes men are cruel and they beat us. Every woman there had had a bad experience, including rape. Since it was a cash business, they were often robbed. And of course, and worse, of course, was that you could get various diseases, including AIDS. I told them I appreciated their candor and hoped to stay in touch. Mary and Constance had email addresses. I told them I was making a donation to the group as it seemed very worthwhile. I started to put away my notebook and get ready to leave. But what do you think? Constance asked abruptly. None of the women I noticed were standing up. I sat back down. What do I think about what? I asked. About our situation. Well, I think working to support a group like this is good, and paying close attention to your medicine and health is the right. No, said Constance. We mean about our situation. I was so thick. I thought I'd just been interviewing them about the work they used to do. You mean, I said, you're still looking now? She nodded. All of you? They all nodded. I took a deep breath. And you can't tell the men, or you'd have no work, and your children would go hungry. Again they nodded. But you can tell them to wear condoms. Yes, but not all of them will, said Jane. We sat and there was silence. I guess it means you should do other work. In Kenya, said Mary, if you have no husband and you have no degree, then there's little hope for you. All the jobs now are demanding HIV tests, especially the hotels. There must be some that don't, I said, not really knowing. What would you do then? Asked Constance. I was totally unprepared. I like to think I would stop this work, I said. Could they be blamed for killing men if the men wouldn't wear condoms? What if the women didn't mention condoms for fear of losing a sale? I think you have to stop, I said, but I'm not sure. And still I'm not. This was so easy for me to say, and they knew it. They knew that I didn't know. Despite my education and advantages, I didn't know. So I don't know how I could tell that without saying that. Truly, not everything I do is gritty and sad. My daughter accuses me of enjoying sad music. I do. But I like that music too. So I wrote a book which is somewhat different from my others. It's about a town many of you may have visited, Aspen, Colorado. I had a great time. I had a great time in Aspen. I began my research as a nighttime cab driver for the Mellowvale Taxi Company, which is an old hippie cab company that had been bought by a friend of our family, and was still a significant source of uncontrolled substances in Aspen. The drivers, many of them made extra money that way, and many thought I was a narc. This has happened several times. I'm often thought to be an undercover drug agent. I got to meet Hunter S. Thompson one night. The dispatcher was looking for someone to deliver a liter of Chivas Regal to him at 2 in the morning, and called me. And I said, where am I going to get Chivas at this hour? And she told me a building to go behind. And she said, honk the horn 3 times, and he'll bring it out to you. And some guy, I still have no idea who that was or even where I was, but I got the liter of Chivas, and as I went down there, I called her, I said, why me? And she said, you're the only one on tonight who won't drink it with him. And she said, will you? And I said, no, I won't drink it with him. And I just had a little. All right. This is from a chapter about real estate called You Cannot Find a Finer Home. After I was a taxi driver, I worked at the Aspen Times, and one way or another, my life just kept coming around to real estate. I find myself in these unbelievable houses, or I don't know, I just decided I really needed a real estate chapter. And this is my favorite part of the real estate chapter. It was almost the last of the Aspen A-frames. It may also have been the first of the Aspen A-frames. The place in Aspen where I hung my hat the longest was an aging, forgotten house at the foot of Red Mountain, just above the art museum where I lived for nearly a year. Named for its shape when viewed head-on, I don't need to explain this to Colorado people like you. The A-frame had a front door of sliding glass. You stepped through it and directly into the living room, beyond which were the kitchen and the bathroom. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms. Aspen once had several of these staples of American snow country architecture, but most were torn down to make room for larger, sturdier houses. There were 2 modified, expanded A-frames around town, but I found only one other that was pure. Though it was on a well-traveled street and they passed by frequently, nobody could ever remember having seen my house. This had probably helped in the long run. The house, through benign neglect, had only improved. In an area of paved driveways, it had a strip of rutted dirt. Amidst the sprinkler systems and landscaping of my neighbors, my house boasted native vegetation, sagebrush and tumbleweeds. The outside light was a meager yellow bulb, such as might be found outside a fisherman's bungalow. A rusty horseshoe hung over the front door. The key was hidden in the woodpile. Located on a capacious corner acre of prime real estate, my A-frame by all rights should have been bulldozed and replaced years before. It was a living anachronism. But my landlords were two old Denver families that had bought it from three bachelors who built it in the 50s, and they planned to keep it indefinitely. Not, I got the sense, through any abiding love of the antique, the funky, the soulful, not as any statement of rebellion against the status quo, but more through the power of inertia. They had it, and they would continue to have it. They'd sell it when they needed to, and the profit was guaranteed. They bought the place for $14,000, and the land above had appreciated to about $800,000. Land above? Land below? Must be a way that makes sense. In the meantime, they rented it all year long, and except for high season, a few weeks on either side of Christmas, it was mine. I became the house's umpteenth tenant when one of the owners, a woman who knew me from my childhood street, it's Franklin Street, 600 block, walked into the Times one day to place a rental ad. "Why, it's Ted Conover," I heard a voice say. She was a Denver landlady of some repute, savvy in that market, but less so in Aspen's. She was preparing to rent the two-bedroom house for the unheard-of sum of $600 a month. I know. The house had, as they say, character. Outside it was stained green with green tar paper roof. 4 wooden panels above the front door with once an eye-catching orange, yellow, green, and red had faded and chipped as a result of their southern exposure. Some loose component of the tubular metal fireplace chimney banged in the wind. The decor was early ski house, indoor-outdoor carpet, a ski rack against one wall, dormitory-style furniture, frame posters hung over wood veneer paneling. It had been updated in the 70s with cheap track lighting and rheostats, but otherwise it was intact. The kitchen in particular was an original. Separated from the rest of the living room by a curving bar finished in ruby red formica and ringed with bar stools, it sported in matching yellow enamel a decrepit Whirlpool dishwasher, metal cabinets, and best, an antique refrigerator built in above the counters as a faux cabinet. The refrigerator, alas, was a decorating idea whose time had come and gone. Its everyday operation was to freeze or melt everything. It could not be repaired, though servicemen would charge you for trying. A baking pan sat permanently stationed beneath the dishwasher to capture the overflow from the rinse cycle. A stereo so old it had to warm up came into place, as did a dial phone. Labels on the stereo directed the guest to frequencies for radio stations that no longer existed. The game cabinet contained a 20-year-old board game modeled on Monopoly called Aspen, in which every space was a business, but only 5 or 6 of these still existed. A 15-year-old phone book contained similar revelations about the transiency of Aspen's commercial sector. Gone were 10 of the first dozen restaurants listed in the yellow pages, all of the boutiques, and all of the gift shops. That's my time. Okay? All right. The A-frame could sleep 8 people, assuming only 1 per single bed. 5 of these would be upstairs, which you arrived at by climbing a wobbly, splintered ladder. From an upstairs bed, the floors were so thin you could hear conversations in the living room beneath you as though nothing intervened. The forced air heat did not make it upstairs. Auxiliary electric floorboard units had been installed, which the landlady, because she would have to pay for it through an arcane metering arrangement, implored me to use only when absolutely necessary. I restricted my use to only most mornings and most nights. Through the large front windows, there was a spectacular view of Aspen Mountain, Shadow Mountain, the lower valley, and a large house under construction across the road. I'm going to skip ahead. The green roof of this new house kept dying, and it would require major reconstruction. I felt the contractor had gone too far when I woke one morning to the sight of 3 men in white protective suits rooting through my sagebrush. It was like a scene from an Aliens movie. They wore respirators and seemed to be taking soil samples. When they returned the next day with a big machine that drilled into the ground, I confronted them. They responded with a sheaf of literature. They were from the EPA, it said, searching for heavy metals in the soil that could have been left from tailings at Stephanopoulos smuggler mine, a short way up the hill from my house. Superfund legislation, if contamination was found, would pay for them to remove all the soil and replace it with good, uncontaminated soil. My landlady phoned me a short while later to tell me the news. The soil around the house was contaminated, but she had declined the offer to dig up the entire lot and had settled instead on the plan to stabilize the area of greatest exposure. They were going, in other words, to pave the driveway for free. She sounded delighted, but I was not. The work had been scheduled but not completed when I moved out one snowy day in November, one step ahead of the improvements. Okay. Among the lessons of my experiments with the first person, I'd like to mention a couple. One is that, and this is sometimes hard for beginning writers to get, but the narrator, that first person, you, does not have to be the smartest guy in the room. You do not have to know everything to be telling the story yourself. In fact, often if you are in an unfamiliar situation, it's your uncertainty that the reader will relate to, and you should be candid about it. I think the confessional idea in nonfiction often works well. You can admit it when you're scared. Not being Superman is important. And then an even more important thing to remember is that in the end, it has to be about them, not you. It's unseemly to use others simply as props for an elaborate selfie, if you will. Okay? And I thought of calling this talk "Me, My Selfie, and I." It seemed too cute, but I'm proud of it. The selfie, it's sort of swept the culture, and I'm figuring it out. But especially if you were writing about people less privileged than you, the reader's not going to want to hear too much about your discomfort or how bad that soup tasted, right? It's sort of, it might go without saying, but I always feel I need to put that in there. You're a guide, and you'll get more credit, I think, by not complaining about most things. And then the ultimate lesson, I think, if you're a young writer thinking about nonfiction, is that there are ways to choose your own adventure, to imagine experience and then go have it. And it doesn't mean going to the other side of the world. It can mean going to the other side of town. It can mean talking to people you don't normally talk to. And often you have to do that on your own. It's hard to do this with a group of your own kind. If you've done study abroad, you know that you learn more French, Spanish, Italian when you're on your own than when you're with everybody else. When you do find that experience, and when you do go have it, remember to think like a writer, meaning be conscious. Every evening or whenever you have time, think about what happened that day. What did it mean? What was your part? Your experience becomes not just who you are, you were changed by that summer, but it becomes your material, right? Your life, if you're going to write it, becomes your material. You have to take notes. Taking notes is a phrase from the journalism side, right? I take notes. Phrase from the personal essay side is you keep a journal. But I like to think it can be the same thing. You can have a personal kind of notes where you include what's going on with you as well as what's going on around you. And put your own experience in context. There's a singer a lot of you probably know named Roseanne Cash, who's wonderfully reflective, has a song with exactly this in the title. The summer I read Colette. It's not about the July I spent in Paris, though broadly that's what it's about. The summer I read Colette, it's about the meaning she found in that summer. And that's something to think about. What does this mean? What's the larger idea? Did I get over my fear of swimming that summer? Were some of my prejudices unfortunately reinforced, and how am I going to handle that? It doesn't always have to be good lessons, but you need to think about what things mean. A common writerly habit of mine is to think of yourself as somewhat separate from yourself. Sometimes I think of a conversation I had, what it would look like in quotation marks, or to be up above and think what this would look like if you were not you but somebody else. To think of yourself, to separate yourself, think of yourself as a character in, to use a phrase invoked both by Inspector Clouseau and the man R.E.M. in Life's Rich Pageant. So thank you very much for listening today, and I'm happy to answer any questions if that would be of help. Yes.
I was teaching an undergraduate nonfiction class, and the phenomenon you were describing of everybody was happy to write memoir and so on, stuff that was more journalistic. The most interesting piece came from this woman. I don't want to stereotype her too much, but she decided she was going to go to the Denver Folklore Center and learn about bluegrass. And she finds herself in Gold Hill. A week later, and writing about this. And what she found was, it was all foreign, and so it was all great, but really had that tough time. She wanted to write it about herself, and her experience being it. And I said, that's actually fine. But that breakover, when you're writing, do you ever feel the needle sort of going, too much me, not enough that, or
Definitely.
With that?
Definitely. And I think my first book, Rolling Nowhere, is the most diary-like. And I think that's where a lot of people start, is with what this was like for me today. I kind of think, so I know Gold Hill was once famous among hippies and older, like 60s dropouts. Is that kind of what Gold Hill is like now?
It's a little bit cleaned up, but still, yeah, more toward that end than the Phoenix suburb that she grew up.
Okay, so she was a fish out of water, being younger and not an old hippie. I would think it would. I mean, there's a lot of humorous possibilities to be with old folkies and. What was that movie, A Mighty Wind? About the folk scene. I mean, there are ways that, I think a lot of her contemporaries and people our age might sympathize with her being in a crowd like that, if she were able to capture some of the language, or, I don't know, the ways they smoke marijuana, or whatever it is that is singular about them would be fun to read about. It's hard to fault somebody who's really putting themselves out there for for focusing more on themselves. I'm more likely just to encourage them to keep going, and I think a writer becomes less interested with himself or herself, maybe on the second or third immersion. I hope, I think. Anybody else? Yes, question?
So, I know there's a generosity of spirit in your work. Is that something you consciously try to do, or is that something because you're an outsider, you think you have to take that position?
I don't know. I mean, an ungenerous spirit can be entertaining.
Yeah.
Many people enjoy Paul Theroux, and sometimes I do. But often I think, right does he have to make fun of those people? And I'm offended. Sometimes I'm offended by him. So maybe if I were conscious of this, it would show I had an even higher level of control than I do, and you would admire me for it. But I really, it's not something I'm that aware of. An editor I know at Harper's Magazine said that a common problem. I invited him to visit a class of mine. He said, "Whatever you guys do when you send me your first pieces, just try to avoid the asshole problem." And I asked him to explain it. He said, "So many people writing first person for the first time are kind of assholes. They're just not appealing. They don't make themselves likable." And I don't think he wanted everyone to be saintly and Will Rogers, but I think it's easy. Your own voice is one of the hardest to control, I think, in terms of tone, and to know how you're sounding. And it helps to have readers who can help you say, "You sound a little taken with yourself there," or whatever. I've had them say it to me, and I'm always grateful for that. It's taking quite a chance to put your own thoughts and sort of especially your unmodulated, your unmoderated, you haven't run these by a lot of people sometimes. You write them and you just have to wait and see. Yes?
Well, fitting right into this is the question I wanted to ask, which is that when you immerse yourself in a situation, then you're inevitably, to some extent, influencing the outcome of that situation. Right. And struck very much by some stories, one that recently listened to on This American Life, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Grimm, which is a story of where the reporter is following a doctor who killed his father and was in prison, and then the other doctor who took his place in the town learned more and more about this other doctor. And the reporter definitely helped. In the end, they actually helped get the doctor out of, or get treated for a medical problem. But it was, the reporter was very much in the story, and actually influenced the outcome. And I found it very moving and powerful, but it was also like, you realize it was like, she, as being a reporter, she was changing the outcome. Yeah, I tend to I'm usually not bothered by that. Well, depending what she did, what outcome she helped influence or bring about, that would make a difference. But as far as the writer acknowledging her presence and the difference it makes, this is something that in the social sciences they've been concerned with for years, how just your presence changes the dynamic in the room. And I'm more comfortable with writing that acknowledges that. And so that's the first part of the answer. And then I guess the second is, in what way is it, would that street gang have gone out
wilding if the reporter weren't there with a video camera, right? That's a bad thing. You don't want to precipitate violence just so that somebody can make a good video. The cure is often time, so that the reporter, the observer, the immerser, the longer he's there, the less of a difference I think he makes. And this is one reason this kind of reporting goes against journalism, because journalism has deadlines and it needs to be about things happening. And if something takes time, it can't always respond to the news cycle. So, yeah. Yes?
I just wondered about your process, because I wondered if the women in Africa or the people in the vineyard or even the taxi dispatcher knew you were a writer. And if there was a point at which you suspend telling them and then you tell them, and also the second question, you said you take notes, but some of the long dialogue passages, do you take them? Do they,
Sure.
Let me ask the process.
No, there's a whole bunch of questions in there. And I'll try to remember them. I tape when I can, and the women in Nairobi I taped because I could. And they knew exactly who I was. Why else would I be there? Why else would they talk to me? Women who brought beers to the drivers I traveled with on my first trip into Central Africa, I didn't say to the drivers, please explain to them that I am a writer from the United States, right? Because that would seem odd, I think. And I didn't know their names, and I wasn't going to identify them. The best practices for journalists is self-disclosure. I'm here to do this. But when you are immersing, you're putting that in the back seat. So, literally, if you're driving a mellow yellow taxi, you are not going to tell. Like, the whole reason to be doing that is to see what happens. And it's interesting. I now teach in the Department of Journalism at New York University. I think 10 or 15 years ago, they would not have wanted me to teach there because the rules, there was an older order and an orthodoxy in reporting that was conducted without full disclosure was seen as unacceptable. But I think on 3 occasions in my work, I have gone in without telling people what I was doing because there was no way otherwise I could have done that. One is when I got a job as a corrections officer. One is when I became a USDA meat inspector. And for part of Rolling Nowhere, I stopped telling people I was a college student because they thought I was bragging and stopped believing me. And so I stopped saying that just also to protect myself. So it's a complicated answer. I like to think if you and I happened to be standing at a bus stop and we were caught in this rain and we had an interesting discussion. And I were a columnist at the Denver Post, and tomorrow I were to describe you and that encounter in a way that made it, you would recognize yourself and people who knew you would recognize you. And I would feel badly having done that secretly. That seems to me wrong. I think whenever possible, I would just say, hey, I'm a columnist for the Denver Post. Do you mind if I write about this conversation? You'd probably say, okay, I don't know, you might not. That's up to you. The rules about this vary a lot, and if you're on assignment for New York Times Magazine, you're going to have more restrictions on how you present yourself than if you're working on a long-term project for a book. As far as taking notes, this area, so there's no fact-checking with memoirs. There is fact-checking with journalism. With nonfiction books, there's not a lot of fact-checking. I write down quotes whenever I can. If I can't, like I'm working in prison, I'll remember things that were interesting. And the minute I can, I will take out my notebook, which I usually keep in this pocket, and I'll write it down. In fact, the picture of me on the cover of New Jack shows that notebook in this pocket, where guards are supposed to keep a notebook, which is great. That really was a lifesaver. Lots of times, I'd be saying, okay, what's the cell number? And I'd be writing down what it said on the graffiti inside this prisoner's cell. Or I'm often writing down things that people don't think I'm writing down. I'm sorry about that.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yeah, sure.
I'm an anthropologist and I have to file for
Yes.
IRB and
Yeah.
I have to be informed consent.
Right.
Quite often the situations that I'm in are not as ethically tricky as the ones that you are.
Right.
How do you deal with that? Do
So,
you have to do IRB?
no. So this is, some people in the room will know what an IRB is. For those who don't, it's an institutional review board, and if you're doing research among human subjects in the academy, you need to tell the board what you plan to do, and they will tell you if it passes muster ethically, right?
But then you also have to do informed consent.
Oh, and then you need to talk to all of your subjects. Do they have to sign things?
Some, or at least orally you have to tell them
Yeah.
what you're doing.
Yeah. So no, journalists don't have to do that, and journalists could not do that and respond in an agile fashion to the news.
But it's the same situation. See what I mean?
Well, it is. Well, here's the way it's similar. It's that you're going in from a position of privilege to learn about somebody else's life, right?
Sometimes.
Okay. Well, I think that to be able to do this work is a privilege. I always think I'm a privileged person when I do it. And IRBs exist because of abuses to people who were unaware of the research being done on them, right? And I think there are lots of good reasons for them. I'd be curious, do you have any examples off the top of your head of journalism that is having a corrosive or destructive effect on uninformed people? I'd be curious to know, because I'm sure it exists.
Yes, probably.
I'm sure it exists. But I think because your audience is typically different from mine. That is, a journalist who writes for the general public, and a professional social scientist writes more often for other professional social scientists. And I don't know that that changes the ethical equation completely, but I think it changes it partly insofar as who's going to read this, right? And how far is it going to go? I think almost every act of in-depth journalism has ethical implications. I think anytime you talk to somebody and then you repeat their story in your own words, you're doing something morally problematic. And often the result displeases the person being interviewed, right? This is a common story. Oh, that journalist twisted everything I said. He got it all wrong. And I hate hearing that. I work hard to not hear it. But sometimes you can say exactly what somebody told you and they will decide that's not how they told you, right? You'll somehow retell it the wrong way and disappoint them. and they will vilify you for being a journalist. There's one more thing I wanted to say about this. The guy I traveled with when I went back to Africa, he's literate. He read what I wrote the first time, and he read what I wrote the second time, and told me it was right, and he liked it. He said he didn't think he would show it to his wife. I said, okay, now, what does that mean? I don't know. His son Facebook messaged me last month. He said, my dad wants to get in touch with you. So I called him, and he wanted to know how I was doing. So that's my personal IRB. Not every story turns out to have such a happy ending. I'm sure there are a few people who probably wish they hadn't run into me or other journalists. I'm sure of it. This is a huge discussion. Some universities have tried to subject departments of journalism to IRBs, and it just kills the journalist. Yes?
I grew up in Austin, and a lot of my friends, we would visit Simpson. We had someone close to us. What prompted you to choose Simpson to become a correctional?
Sure. Just a quick question. Did you say you and your friends would visit the prison?
Yeah, because we had someone close. We lived in Austin because of circumstances. And so
it's not so easy to visit.
It's not.
But you got tours? Or?
Yeah, and I personally had someone there that was close to me.
Okay.
And he graduated from the college program.
The what program?
The college program.
Okay. Oh, good. So he was a prisoner?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what prompted you to choose Simpson to work at?
So the way it worked was I got an assignment from the New Yorker to write about correction officers. And then I figured with an assignment from the New Yorker, the state would let me accompany workers to work. But they wouldn't. They felt no obligation at all to let the press of the prisons. And they didn't care who gave me the assignment. And so that's when I decided I would be justified in applying for the job myself. Because I thought the public has a right to know what happens in these prisons. They're not the CIA. It's not Langley. It's Austining. And there's a lot of people in there. It's the second largest employer in New York State Corrections after Verizon. But to get to your question, I was assigned to attend the Corrections Academy in Albany for 7 weeks. And on your last day at the academy, they tell you where you will report for work on Monday. So on a Friday, they tell you where in the whole state of New York you'll be on Monday. And 3/4 of my class was assigned to Sing Sing. And that's because it is so low on the desirability scale. Officers, at least when I was one, transfer out as soon as they can because it has this chaotic, corrupt reputation. And it was, however, one of the state prisons closest to where I live in the Bronx. And also, it's Sing Sing. So, and I was thinking ahead at this point, New Jack, guarding the Mid-Orange Correctional Facility. It doesn't have quite the same ring as New Jack guarding Sing Sing, right? Because no one's heard of it. So to be in a prison that people have heard of is a big advantage if you want to sell a book. And I was curious too, because I'd seen movies set in Sing Sing. It just has such a mystique, right? That name. So I didn't really choose it. I was just happy when I got sent there. But what a strange place. And one day I worked on it's called construction detail. So if people come in to work on the buildings from outside, an officer has to sit with them. And the guys I was sitting with on the roof were Ecuadorian, undocumented migrants. And they were fixing the roof of a high security building. And then on your way home, you drive by these crack houses just like 2 blocks from the prison. And then operating in plain view, I mean, drugs being sold right and left, and you could see it from the guard tower. And I was always struck by that, how the presence of that place doesn't seem to strike fear in the heart of everybody. But it struck fear in the heart of me. I mean, it's a scary building. How did you feel in there?
You know, you can take the Metro North Railroad right through it, so I became pretty accustomed to it. You know, it was a mile from my house.
Yeah.
So that was my neighborhood. Most of my friends had someone close to them in Sing Sing.
As a prisoner?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of my younger friends, you know, I went to Park Elementary, public schools in Elson, they're not great. And a lot of them moved there because their father or whoever was in Sing Sing,
Wow.
they wanted to be close. So I found a lot of demographics, a lot of my friends, you know, growing up, I would go to their houses and you'd never see dad around. And I never realized why, but looking back, you know, childhood experiences.
Now, one of the really upsetting things about working in prison is you feel like you're in an institution full of dads. And you are, in a way. And to work in the visit room, I have a section about this in my book, it just breaks your heart. And I was like, trying to keep it together, and I was sitting at this desk in front next to a guy I'd gone through the academy with in Colton. And I said, God, doesn't it kind of get to you sometimes? And he said, yeah, it's a regular Hallmark car. So, there's that.
Well, I think Ted might stay for a few minutes to talk individually. We don't want to prevail on him too long, but let's thank him once more.